It started like any other summer night, the air thick with humidity and the faint hum of cicadas in the background. Karen was sitting in her living room, her fingers drumming anxiously on the armrest of the couch. The barking had started again. She'd complained before countless times. The dog next door, an old hound with a howl that pierced through the night like a siren, would start at dusk and continue long into the early hours. She had tried everything. Polite notes, knocks on the neighbor's door, even calling animal control. But nothing seemed to change. Tonight, though, Karen had had enough. The barking was louder, more frantic, and after weeks of sleepless nights, her patience had finally snapped. She grabbed her flashlight and marched out into the night, her robe billowing in the slight breeze. The dog was barking wildly from the backyard, and Karen, her jaw clenched in irritation, made her way over to the neighbor's fence. The yard was dark, the only light coming from the porch, casting long shadows across the lawn. She could barely make out the figure of the dog, pacing near the back corner, whining and barking into the darkness beyond. Karen opened the gate, stepping into the yard. She was going to confront her neighbor once and for all, make him understand that this had to stop. But before she could take another step, she froze. There was something else in the yard, something moving. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw it. A shape, human-like, crouched low near the back of the house. The dog was barking at it, growling, the fur on its back standing on end. Karen's heart began to pound in her chest as she fumbled with the flashlight, trying to shine it towards the figure. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The figure moved, darting behind the shed, and without thinking, Karen ran after it. She rounded the corner, her flashlight beam bouncing erratically, and found herself face to face with her neighbor, Mr. Dalton. He was panting, his eyes wide with something between fear and fury. "What are you doing here?" Karen demanded, her voice harsh but her fear palpable. Dalton didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced back toward the shed, a glimmer of panic in his eyes. "It's not what it looks like," he finally said, raising his hands slightly, palms open. Karen's gaze shifted past him to the shed door, which was slightly ajar. Something about the way it was cracked open, just a sliver, sent a shiver down her spine. Before she could react, the barking grew louder, more frantic. The dog lunged forward, and in the chaos, Dalton moved to grab Karen, his hands catching her shoulders as she stumbled backward. She let out a scream, and in her panic, swung the flashlight at him. It connected with a dull thud, and Dalton crumpled, hitting the ground with a heavy, lifeless thud. Karen stood there, her breathing ragged, her hands trembling as she looked down at her neighbor, motionless on the ground. The flashlight had rolled away, casting an eerie glow across the yard. She didn't mean to hit him that hard. She just wanted to get away. The dog had stopped barking, now pacing anxiously around its owner's body, whining softly. Karen backed away, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She had to call for help, had to explain what happened. But as she turned, she noticed something. The shed door still slightly open. A faint noise was coming from inside, a muffled rustling, almost like someone or something was in there. She hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to run, but something pulled her forward. She had to know what was in that shed. She slowly approached, her hands trembling as she pushed the door open. The smell hit her first, a sickly metallic odor that made her stomach turn. Inside, she saw a chair, ropes hanging loosely from its arms, and on the ground, a pile of clothes stained dark. Her mind struggled to make sense of what she was seeing. It wasn't just a shed. It was some kind of holding place. The clothes on the floor were torn, like someone had struggled, fought to get free. Suddenly, a noise behind her made her spin around. Standing there, silhouetted against the dim light from the house, was a figure. Not Dalton. He was still lying on the ground where she had left him. This figure was taller, broader, its face obscured by the shadows. Karen's breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped closer, the dim light catching the glint of something metallic in its hand. Karen turned and ran, her feet barely touching the ground as she sprinted towards the fence. She could hear the figure behind her, its footsteps heavy and deliberate, gaining on her. She reached the gate, throwing it open, and dashed into her own yard, slamming the door behind her as she stumbled into her house. She grabbed her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed 911, her eyes never leaving the window, watching for any sign of movement outside. The police arrived within minutes, their lights flashing, casting blue and red across the quiet street. They found Dalton where he had fallen, but the shed was empty. No sign of the figure Karen had seen, no evidence of anyone else being there. The officers questioned her, their faces a mix of skepticism and concern, but Karen could barely hear them. Her eyes kept drifting to the darkened yard next door, to the shadows that seemed to shift and move with a life of their own. They took Dalton away, his body covered by a sheet, and the dog was led off by animal control, its eyes wide and confused. Karen watched from her window, her mind numb, the reality of what had happened struggling to sink in. She had killed him. She had killed her neighbor. But as the night wore on, a new fear began to take hold. The figure she had seen, the one with the metallic glint, was still out there. The next day, the police returned. They had questions about Dalton, about the shed, about what she had seen. They asked if she knew anything about the people who had gone missing in the neighborhood over the past few months. Karen felt her blood run cold. Missing people? She shook her head, her mind reeling. She hadn't heard about anyone going missing. The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions dark. That night, Karen couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind against the window made her jump. She kept seeing Dalton's face, the panic in his eyes, the way he had looked past her, towards the shed. She knew there was something she was missing, something important, and then it hit her. The dog. The dog had been barking, not at her, not at Dalton, but at whatever had been in the shed. Karen grabbed her flashlight, her hands trembling as she made her way back outside. She had to know, she had to see for herself. The yard was silent, the air still, the shed door hanging open. She stepped inside, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The chair was still there, the ropes, the pile of clothes, and then she saw it, a small door at the back of the shed, half hidden behind a stack of boxes. A door she hadn't noticed before. She approached it, her heart pounding, her breath shallow. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the cold metal handle. Slowly, she pulled it open, the hinges creaking loudly in the stillness. Inside, the darkness seemed to stretch on forever, a narrow staircase leading down into the earth. Karen felt her stomach drop, a sense of dread washing over her. Whatever was down there, whatever Dalton had been hiding, it wasn't over, not yet. Story 2. The snow was falling in gentle flurries as the neighbors heard the muffled thud of a door slamming. The street, lined with identical houses and manicured lawns, had always been quiet. The kind of place where everyone waved politely but stayed out of each other's business. No one expected that polite distance to be shattered by the events of that January night. It started with a noise complaint. Nathan Miller, a man known for his quiet demeanor, had called the police, his voice calm but tense. It wasn't the first time he had complained about the noise from the Thompsons' house next door. They were always having loud gatherings. Nathan had tolerated it for years, his life a sequence of patient nods and strained smiles. But this time, the noise had reached a point that seemed to break something within him. The officers arrived just past 10, their cruiser casting blue flashes across the pristine white snow. They approached the Thompsons' front door, expecting to resolve yet another petty dispute. The Thompsons opened the door, their laughter dying down the moment they saw the uniforms. "It's him again, isn't it?" Mrs. Thompson sighed, an edge of irritation in her voice. They'd had enough of the Millers' complaints, the quiet stares, the notes left on the porch. Inside his house, Nathan watched from his living room window, his knuckles white as he gripped the curtain. He was tired. Tired of the noise, of the Thompsons, of being the man who everyone thought was weak. He could feel his heart pounding in his ears, drowning out everything else. The tension had been growing inside him for years. Years of polite indifference, of wanting to scream, but never finding his voice. Tonight, something was different. After the officers left, the Thompsons decided to have a word with Nathan. They'd had enough of the accusations, the whispered complaints to the neighborhood association. Mr. Thompson marched over, a bottle of wine in his hand, half empty, his face flushed from the drink. He pounded on Nathan's door, the thuds echoing down the street. The door opened just a crack, revealing Nathan's eyes, dark and hollow. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Mr. Thompson smirked, shoving the door open further. "You need to lighten up, Miller. All this fuss over a bit of music. You're gonna die from stress if you don't learn to relax." Nathan's gaze flicked to the bottle in Thompson's hand, his jaw clenching. In a flash, the door swung open wide, and before Thompson could react, Nathan pulled him inside. The door slammed shut, the sound muffled by the falling snow. No one saw what happened next. No one heard the muffled shouts or the sudden silence that followed. It wasn't until Mrs. Thompson, impatient and still half laughing at her husband's bravado, decided to follow him over, that the screams began. She barely had time to open her mouth before Nathan, covered in blood, pulled her inside too. The door slammed again, the locks clicking into place. The street remained silent, the snow falling heavier, hiding the chaos behind those four walls. Hours passed before anyone noticed something was wrong. It was nearly 2 a.m. when the police returned, responding to frantic calls from other neighbors. The officers knocked, then pounded, their shouts echoing into the stillness of the early morning. No answer. They broke down the door. The scene inside was a nightmare. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson lying lifeless on the floor, and Nathan slumped beside them, a knife in his hand. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling, as if in those final moments he had found some twisted version of peace. The investigation that followed unearthed things no one could have imagined. They found journals, boxes of them, where Nathan had meticulously recorded every slight, every moment of disrespect, real or imagined. Years of resentment documented in obsessive detail. But the strangest part was a series of entries about a child that no one in the neighborhood had ever seen. The journals spoke of a little girl named Lily, Nathan's daughter. He wrote about her laughter, her games in the yard, her love for music. But there were no photos of her, no records. Neighbors were baffled. Nathan and his wife had never had children. She had died years ago, they said. A car accident, they thought. But the details were hazy, the kind of thing that people forget over time because it's easier than facing the truth. Then came the photos, dozens of them, found in a locked drawer in Nathan's study. Photos of the Thompsons, taken without their knowledge. But in each photo, there was something else. A shadow, a figure in the background. A little girl, her face blurred, always just out of focus. She was there, watching, every time the Thompsons were outside, every time they were near the Miller's house. The police dismissed it as a trick of the light, a flaw in the film. But the neighbors weren't so sure. They remembered the way Nathan would sometimes stand at his window, staring out at the Thompsons' house, his lips moving as if he were speaking to someone. They remembered the times they heard music playing softly from his house, a lullaby that seemed to drift through the walls, even though they knew Nathan lived alone. The house was boarded up after that, left to decay. No one wanted to buy it. People said they could still hear things sometimes. Soft whispers, the laughter of a child, the faint strains of a lullaby carried on the wind. The Thompsons' house was sold. The new owners unaware of what had happened there, of the blood that had stained the floors. And sometimes late at night, the neighbors would see a figure in the window of the old Miller house, a man standing still, staring out at the world with hollow eyes. And next to him, just for a moment, the shadow of a little girl. Her face turned towards the Thompsons' house, her laughter echoing faintly in the night.